Well, I'm a career educator. I've been an educator since I started my career um, a few decades ago. I started out as a French teacher, and in the States, in the Milwaukee area, Detroit and Milwaukee. And then my husband and I, who he's also an educator, um, decided we would explore international opportunities. And that landed us in Kuwait, which is where we really spent the vast majority of our educational careers. And that's also where I met Stephen and Aida.
Hmm.
And in in the time that we spent there, we were there for almost probably 17 years, right? Like our children started, like our daughter was in pre-K, which was the 3-year-old program. Our son was in first grade, and they both graduated from that school. So it was an international school, but it became our neighborhood school, if you will. Um, and I would say that's where, I mean, the bulk of my career, I spent 10 or 11 years of our time there as the curriculum director,
Amazing.
working on curriculum, kind of kind of self-taught in a lot of ways because it's an isolated, it's a bit of a, it's not a unicorn role, but it's you're the only one in the
Mhm.
school, right? And you don't necessarily have a team that you're working with. You're kind of, left to figure things out on your own.
Yeah.
Um, during my time in that role, like I took advantage of opportunities to pursue um, some additional roles outside of like the curriculum role that are connected and kind of pivotal in how I moved forward.
Hmm.
I became an MYP workshop leader. If you're familiar with the International Baccalaureate, the middle years program is grade 6 through 10. And I kind of had always dreamt of, like, after I went to my first workshop, I'm like, oh, I'd love to be a workshop leader, and had the opportunity to become a workshop leader. And in that training, there was an emphasis on andragogy, the
Hmm.
concept of,
Yeah.
adults have a particular style, or there are ways in which we can meet the needs of adult learners that look different than pedagogy.
Hmm.
Obviously, I mean, it's obvious now, but at the time it was a little bit like, oh, mind blowing.
Hmm.
Um, so that really kind of started to impact how I thought about and approached working with adults, whether it was trying to bring them into the fold to implement new curriculum, to try out instructional strategies, to just, to work with an instructional coach, because eventually that became my team. I oversaw the instructional coaches.
Hmm.
Um, and I also was in the process of, I don't, you might be familiar with, but also might not, Critical Friends Group work. It's part of the National School Reform Faculty. It's a specific type of PLC that is, where conversations are guided by conversation protocols,
Oh.
depending on what your intention or what your purpose is in a conversation, getting feedback on your work, whether it's like a policy statement or a unit of a curriculum unit, bringing a professional dilemma to the group to kind of follow a particular set of steps to arrive at a certain point. And ideally, you're getting feedback and thinking differently about a professional practice. So I pursued that, and I work with them as an international facilitator. So that kind of impacted how I thought about collaboration and how to successfully, purposefully bring people together, provide spaces for people to feel included, where their voices were heard, where they were hearing other voices as well. Uh, so those are a couple of my own professional learning that I pursued that really impacted how I moved forward over time. I mean, this didn't happen overnight, right? But
Right.
working with, we had different coordinators for each of the IB programs who they weren't my direct reports, but we collaborated often very closely. And helping them to understand how to work with groups of teachers and setting up structures and systems in order to use time during the day. I feel like our schedules at the time were pretty generous with collaborative time. And so kind of identifying, okay, here, this one collaborative time each cycle, your team is meeting with your coordinator and you're working on planning and, you know, moderating assessments, whatever types of instructional curricular things that need to be happening. But then also helping teams to understand what collaboration was like, what were the expectations for collaboration, right?
Right.
Kind of moving from the here, you create this part of the lesson, I'll create this part, and then we'll teach each other's parts and not understand what the other person has created, but we'll muddle through. Okay.
What you're basically speaking about is the way I've heard is that your approach to helping develop other educators and develop programs that enable learning in pedagogy actually came from an approach from andragogy, right?
Yeah.
With
Yeah.
collaborative frameworks and you mentioned that within AIS or within IB, the International Baccalaureate program, there was a lot of room for, I guess, in-service or development.
Yeah. Yes.
Would that
Yeah.
go on in the school day or after school, or would that be, a certain day of the week? How was that
Yeah.
actually put into effect?
Yeah. All of the above. I think we had probably a bit of an advantage because the International Baccalaureate, part of their standards and practices, if you will, there's an expectation that schools have a particular, like a earmarked part of the budget for IB training. And the term that's often used in the IB world is like upskilling.
Yeah,
Um,
upskilling.
so yeah,
Exactly.
so there was the kind of the pot of money that was used to either send people out for training, which, that's kind of pricey because it's, air, hotel, stipend, all that. Or to bring a trainer to the site to train everyone. That had to be kind of specific because it needed to apply to a large group of people, whereas sometimes the trainings that are offered are very kind of subject specific. So you kind of have to pick and choose. However, that aside, um, we had definitely a leadership team over the years who really valued um, upskilling people. Like we had every Tuesday was staff meeting, and it transitioned from kind of the sit and get information delivery to that Tuesday, everybody has to be here for that extra hour. That's an opportunity for learning. And so it really became um, Tuesdays were professional development for an hour after school. And it looked different. Like, you had 4 Tuesdays in a month. So 2 Tuesdays would be divisional, elementary, middle, high. One would be for the specific program, whether it was primary years, middle years, diploma. And then another would be, maybe it was departments, but departments had time during the day as well. It matters not that particular detail, but the structure was there and the expectation and the time was provided for professional learning.
Did you have
Um,
measurements or metrics that you had to meet based on that? I mean, it's great you had sponsorship, right? That
yeah.
informed what the requirement was. It set up the expectations. You had
Yeah.
the opportunity for the instructors and the teachers to actually build during the professional time, right?
Mhm.
Um, was there anything that you had to kind of assess where you were in current state and then for future state, what to look at? Just,
Yeah. So I would say there probably weren't a lot of metrics that we were using.
Mhm,
You know, these aren't metrics, but I would say we would use the calendar, if you
mhm.
will, as
Yeah.
a guide, right? Knowing that um, reporting was coming up. Well, teachers would they need some, we need to emphasize or help them, remind them, and offer opportunities for them to understand the assessment rubrics and their responsibilities to assessment. And sometimes it was nuts and bolts of like, here's literally how you use the grading
Yeah.
platform to put things in. Um, AIS in Kuwait was, I feel like it was a little bit unique
Hmm.
in some ways because Kuwait is never on anyone's list of, it's not on your people's bucket lists. So it was a bit of an incubator of sorts
Hmm.
where teachers who were new to internet, had never been in international education, did not have IB experience, maybe had very minimal experience as a teacher in a classroom.
Hmm.
Those were often the base of our teaching staff.
Hmm.
So it was a lot of recognizing that we were, and we would turn over about 30% of the staff every year.
Every
So
year.
knowing, yeah, every year. So knowing that we would have this large group of people coming in every year and staying for generally their 2-year contracts. Sometimes, people would stay 3 or 4, but you could count on people staying for 2 years. So it was a bit of a 2-year professional development plan,
Mhm.
knowing that they needed, we kind of knew what the basics were that they needed um, when they were first coming in. And each of the coordinators they would have, like, for the first 6 weeks of school, they would have all the new teachers for an hour
Mhm.
in addition to the staff meetings, like another day after school. They would
Mhm.
take them through a 6-week kind of introduction to that.
How did you recruit your teachers?
So recruiting in the international world, you have a lot of there are a lot of prongs.
Mhm.
That's not quite the term I'm looking for, but you're reaching in a lot of different directions. So
Sure.
there are um, recruiting organizations, companies that,
Mhm.
they kind of have the databases of, teachers put their stuff in, and then schools pay a subscription and they're able to go through the databases and
Mhm.
reach out and look for, find people that way. Those organizations also have recruiting fairs throughout the recruiting season, which is kind of starting up now through like about January, February are like the high times for recruiting. And so teachers and school leaders and recruiters from schools travel to different places for different recruiting conferences um, to actually, it's a little bit like speed dating, I think,
Yeah,
where
get the
you
picture
kind of have a
now.
line of people, and
Yeah.
they come up and they tell you what they've got to offer, and you kind of make a quick decision. Do we want to schedule an interview for later today or tomorrow? And then kind of move from there.
How do you think the
Um,
outcome of the the instructional outcome? Like, how well did students actually do at AIS?
So I mean, our students were actually, we had a lot of students who were very successful.
Hmm.
Um, you know, Graduation rates were very high. Not all students would pursue the IB diploma program, but many did. And again, they were also very successful there. I found it, my husband and I, he was an administrator at the school, and we
Hmm.
always just kind of over time seeing kids kind of grow, right? Being kind of like, little squirrely in middle school, and a little bit making some bad decisions in high school, but then kind of coming together, going to university, and then coming back and like having a profession, right? You're like, wow, I can't say I ever really saw that happening for that kid, but there they are. So I think it's the I guess there were kids who struggled,
Hmm.
and I would say some of that probably there were a lot of different factors. Sometimes
Yeah.
it was that maybe the school wasn't the best fit, but culturally there was a certain status with being at that school, so parents would just
Ah.
like they would tolerate, or kind of demand loudly that their students needed something more than what they were getting.
Hmm.
And sometimes that was a reasonable request, but of course, as leaders, you kind of have to balance you're not going to say, yeah, actually, your child is in a class with a teacher who really isn't as skilled as some of the others. I mean, that's not,
Hmm.
you're not throwing the teachers under the bus. Um, so I think they I think they were quite successful. I think
Yeah.
it's hard. The work of educating kids is hard because I feel like there's a personality that enters it, and maybe we're perfectionists. And when students aren't, you know, hitting all of the metrics and surpassing them, we're like, oh, they're failing, we're failing. It's not working.
Hmm.
But I think kids were getting a pretty solid education. I mean, our my two children, our children graduated, and they're quite successful,
And
young
they came
adults,
through
but
the Kuwaiti, they came through the
they
IB.
did.
Yeah, and I think that there are so many variables, like you mentioned, that can contribute and inform, um,
Yeah.
education and educational outcomes. I think that even within schools that, are struggling, for instance,
Hmm.
that may not be the ideal school, there are still pockets of excellence
Yes.
that take place, with educators going the extra mile, or being engaging, or an administrator, or whoever that is. So in this case, what I'm wondering, because it sounds like you had all the earmarks of continuous improvement, at
Hmm.
AS that you helped introduce and enforce, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So with that in mind, with so that had to do with, teachers that were, some were new, you mentioned, to education, and or certainly an international
Hmm.
baccalaureate, right?
Hmm.
And so having earmarked specific days for development is very important. What
Hmm.
and to enable that sponsorship is huge, right? If you have
Yeah. Yes.
the powers that be, the decision makers that are basically behind and say education is valuable. We value education.
Yeah.
And because of that, we want to ensure that there is continuous growth. Those are benefits, I think,
Yeah.
to the school. Did you find that was a
Well,
particular
yeah, as
draw?
you're saying that, it's so my husband, he was the director of this school, the head of school for a while, and did a lot of the recruiting. It
Hmm.
was a huge factor to attract people, right? It's like, yeah, okay, Kuwait may not be, it's not a difficult place to live, but it's
Hmm.
also not on people's bucket lists, right? It's not
Hmm.
Paris.
Right.
um, but you can come and spend a couple of years here. You can make some decent money. Um, Actually, a lot of young educators come and pay off their student loans.
Hmm.
Um, but you're also going to get a lot of training, and we actually kind of became a bit of a we kind of I think when we embraced that idea and that we were a bit of a launching pad for international educators, for careers. I mean, everybody's got to have their niche, right?
Hmm.
you know, we weren't the school where people were coming to stay for 7, 10 years, but we could impact the greater international community
Hmm.
by sending people off after a couple of years with us to other schools. And it wasn't uncommon for to hear like a common piece of feedback that we would get after people left. They're like, "Oh my gosh, like we are now kind of the expert in the school that's had this program, had the IB. It's not a new program, but like we know just as much, if not more, than some of the people who have been here doing it, right?" Um, so, I obviously that's just anecdotal,
Hmm.
but that was a fairly common. And when teachers would go out for training,
Hmm.
um, and be in a training scenario with teachers from around, the world,
Hmm.
they would come back and say, I was actually explaining things to people at my table group, because and it's, people often, at least what in my experience is, people often were like, oh, we need to go out for education because, in training, because it's going to be better than what anybody's doing here.
Hmm.
It's, and then, so that was always kind of, it was a very common thing. People would go out and come back and be like, yeah, I ended up like teaching people some things while I was out, because
Wow. So
what
they
we're
were
being
able to
offered here is,
inform, to bring more
yeah, yeah,
knowledge to
yeah,
the, it sounds like informally to the events, the teaching events,
exactly,
teaching
yeah,
events based
yeah,
on their
yeah,
time through the IB program, the
yeah,
educators program through AIS.
yeah.
Just that we're about to wrap up, and thank you so much for your
Okay.
time. This has been wonderful.
I hope it's helpful. I hope it's
It's very
what
helpful.
you're
Thank you
looking for.
so
Okay.
much. I'm just thinking about like, did the students find the curriculum challenging? Did they
Hmm.
find it engaging? Were there any academic awards, or how do you know? How do you know? It doesn't have to be anything big or anything like that.
Hmm.
How did you know that you were actually on the right track as far as the students were concerned? The outcomes that you saw from
Um,
from the
yeah,
curriculum.
yeah. So I think, I mean, I think with any kind of K-12 school or school district, especially private, it's that end product, your graduates, where they're going, what they're doing. Um, and that there was a pretty high success rate, acceptance rates, that sort of thing. But kind of in that day to day, kind of down through the continuum, I think a lot of times, like kids were pretty, they were pretty vocal about whether they liked what they were doing or not.
Hmm.
um, and whether that's kids in general or kids in the setting that we were in Kuwait, like they would be very engaged. You could tell when they really appreciated kind of collaborative projects, things, deconstructing a project and then recreating a project. The the IB is also like at the end of each program, there at the end of the PYP, there's it's called an exhibition.
And sorry, what's
Uh,
EYP?
Primary years, that's
Oh, yeah,
the young kinder through grade 5.
got it.
And then the middle years program had like a personal project. And then the IB diploma has an extended essay. So
Hmm.
these are all kind of, it starts out as a group and then a personal type of project. And, you could see the engagement and just the excitement because there would be like the big open house and the parents and teachers would come and kids would talk about the projects that they had been engaged in. And
Hmm.
with the youngest program, it's a lot about environmental, it's not environmental, it's like community action. And so, and there's a component of that in
Mm.
the middle years as well. So you could see them getting very excited about seeing how what they were doing and learning was connected to
Ah,
the real world.
yes,
Um, and so, you know,
that's very important.
yeah, I'm
So
not sure that really answers the
it
question
really
per
answers the
se, but
question. It really does.
yeah,
Because that's an important part of adult learning. You have
yeah,
to be able to have something that's contextual to what's important to you,
yes,
your world. And even more so with children, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
I think just in summarizing this, and tell me if I have it right or not, what I've heard you say, if we were to break down some different things as to uh, what made learning successful through the AIS program or the through AIS,
Yeah.
through the
Hmm.
IB program that you played a great part in is a few different things. Continuous learning and improvement that was sponsored um, by the senior administrators, or who would you say that
Yes.
group,
Yep.
that body was?
Senior leadership, as well
Mhm.
as the board. I
As
mean,
well as the
they were
board.
ultimately the people who also needed to approve the calendar, and that there were like 3 to 5 full days also of professional learning throughout the school year.
Right. So that was then baked in. That's baked in.
Exactly.
And then that also was a draw in recruiting instructors and recruiting teachers. The other thing was in the recruitment practices yourself, you worked with different international recruiting
Hmm.
bodies that, helped to usher in instructors,
Hmm.
teachers, educators. And then part of the other thing is they were it sounds like also they were given, even though like you mentioned, Kuwait is not on anyone's bucket list, or could be, but part of that idea, I know through Aida and Stephen, one of the things was it provided a more comfortable lifestyle
Yeah,
that
definitely.
than they would have had in the States to be able to raise their
Hmm.
own family and to
Yeah.
provide, for instance, different resources,
Hmm.
that they could
Yes.
afford. So
Yep.
affordability, so by compensation in some way. Um, and then as an outcome, the students themselves gave qualitative information, right,
Yes.
about
Yes.
how well they were doing. You mentioned a high um, graduation rate. So
Hmm.
can you talk very briefly about the range of what that looked like? Was that in the 90th percentile or the
Easily, and comfortably. And there were different academic pathways that
Mhm.
students took. As well, everybody was kind of on a very similar pathway until like that 11th and 12th grade year, those years where students could take the full IB diploma over the
Mhm.
course of those 2 years. Students could take what's called certificate courses, which means maybe they pick and choose maybe 2 or 3 IB specific courses and then round out their schedule with just kind of AIS curriculum, which would have been based in Common Core and GSS type standards. Or they would opt to just do the complete AIS curriculum program. So, you know, there was a lot of self-selection or parent
Mhm.
selection, if you will. So students could pursue the academic path that felt the most fit for what they were capable of and ready and interested in doing. So I think some choice like that provided um, greater success than
Yeah.
saying everybody will take this the IB diploma, which is pretty rigorous. And I mean, there are pathways for a wide variety of student abilities to be successful, but it takes a certain amount of it takes a certain level of drive to be successful. And sometimes teenage brains aren't there.
Yeah. So that would be the most rigorous, the
Yeah,
AIS
yeah, yes,
pathway. Otherwise, you
yes.
have
The
certificate,
IB pathway,
the
yeah,
IB pathway,
yeah,
or the certificate program. Would that be then that?
exactly. That would kind of balance. That would provide some of the rigor of the IB with. I hate to say that like IAS courses weren't rigorous, but
Mm-hmm.
I would say over the course of the 2 years of an IB diploma, one course is the equivalent of like a university semester course, right?
Oh, wow.
And it resulted in, for a lot of students, credits at their universities that they were accepted into.
Oh, now we're talking. Oh, wow.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And then so for the certificate, would the equivalent be just like standard uh, coursework that would be like an American
So
education?
when
What
they
would
would,
that
if
look
they
like?
only chose to take two or three or a smaller number of IB courses, they still were held to the same standard and they would take the final, the IB exams and that sort of thing. But the entire program required um, documenting over the course of the 2 years, uh, community service hours, right, doing that extended essay, intensive research, deep research project. I feel like there were a couple of other elements that were kind of wrapped the entire program, wrapped the courses and made the entire program. Whereas if you just took, two or three, you weren't beholden to those additional aspects of it.
Wow, so there was choice from the most rigorous to something that took in between, right? And
Mhm.
so it could
Yeah,
meet students where they were.
exactly,
Okay.
exactly.
Thank you so much. This has been extremely helpful. It has informed my education about uh, educational systems in the UAE um, and the Gulf. So, what's next for you? Just briefly.
So
We have less than a minute.
it's okay. So I'm my co-author and I've actually written a book, Finding Your Path as a Woman in School Leadership. My co-author and I did that project. We're writing our next book, which is kind of on belonging and instructional coaching.
Hmm.
Um, I have a small portfolio of leaders that I work with as a
Hmm.
coach, and I'm trying to write a novel. I don't know. I'm just,
We're
you
aligned
know,
in that aspect. I've written one novel, but we should talk more. Thank
indeed,
you.
I would love it.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Christina Botybl, for your commitment to education and for
Yeah.
helping in this discussion.